Oil paint has been on the market for over 600 years now and has continued to offer new opportunities to experiment with ever since. Alla prima painting, which we tried last time, is a relatively recent invention from the 19th century. Previously, the artists had always outdone each other in new secret recipes. The paint was painted on top of each other in thick or thin layers, and additives were developed that made the paint more elastic or rigid, or that made it dry faster or slower. But everyone was equally fascinated by how shimmering, translucent shades of color could be achieved by layering the colors on top of each other, and how relief-like results could be achieved by playing with thin or thick paint. It is impossible to show you the one way to paint with oil paint in layers. Today, we will first look at one of the common methods that many artists around the world still use today. Hello and welcome to Art for Everybody and the second part of my oil painting course for beginners. My name is Evi Steiner-Böhm. I'm an artist from Germany, and I also have two assistants who are called Pedro and Rosa, and they sometimes give you useful tips in my videos here on YouTube. So I hope you had time to do all the exercises I gave you in the first part of my course, because today it's going to be a little more complicated, because we are going to look at how to build up an oil painting in layers. To understand the problem that you face when you want to paint oil paint in several layers on top of each other, you have to know that oil dries differently than water. When water dries, it turns into gas and escapes into the air and is gone. Oil, on the other hand, doesn't really dry, but rather hardens. And during this process, it absorbs oxygen and thereby changes its chemical composition. And it also changes its volume. And this mobility requires that the layers be placed on top of each other in such a way that on the one hand they connect well, and on the other hand that the lower layers do not tear the upper ones apart due to the movement. In this glass, you can see very clearly how deep the wrinkles are that pure oil forms over time. At some point, it was discovered that oil that was mixed with a solvent expanded less, and that a fat layer of oil could be placed over this lean layer without it cracking. Because on the one hand, this equalizes elasticity, and on the other hand, the adhesion between the layers works better. And this is the famous fat over lean rule. Let's see how it works. I have cadmium red here, but you can also try this with other colors as well. Now I just diluted with a little linseed oil and put it on my painting surface. And it feels rough and thick. And now I take linseed oil mixed with turpentine, and I get a slightly more liquid color that also feels a little bit rougher. And now, if I only use turpentine, the paint becomes very thin, and what you see now is the correct arrangement of how to properly build up an oil painting in layers. Of course, you can also paint more than 3 layers on top of each other. Then it's important that you add less turpentine and more oil from layer to layer. And by the way, if you want to paint on a dried layer of oil again, it's advisable to rub the picture a little with oil to improve adhesion. So let's look at the whole thing with a simple example. I photographed a still life for you, and you have already painted spherical objects like these two apples several times as homework, so they shouldn't be too difficult. Today, a jug, which is a cylinder, is added. A cylinder also is very simple in terms of drawing. You just have two lines down here, and you have to be careful that this oval here and this oval down there are approximately the same. That's all there is to it. And as with our last still life, I placed my objects quite classically in the middle. I made sure that the distance up here and down here is about the same, and here is about the same. However, I made sure that I got a fairly interesting composition, which means I have objects of different sizes, the jug, the apples, and this small leaf down here. And I have placed them so that they overlap significantly. This makes it easy for the viewer to realize the spatial depth. I now do the preliminary drawing with waterproof ink. Pencil, I'm going to show you, would be dissolved by the turpentine oil, and we don't want that. And with waterproof ink, it works. If you do not have any ink, you can also use an ink pen, of course. So now I have to wait until my ink is dry, and then I can erase the remains of the graphite beneath my ink painting. I will paint my picture in a total of 3 layers. And the first layer now is the so-called imprimatura. This is a first, very thin colored layer that is placed over the preliminary drawing. And on the one hand, it supports the basic color mood of my picture. And on the other hand, I can also use it to roughly determine the light and dark values in my picture. In this case, I'm using burnt sienna, which is a very warm shade, because I think it supports the mood of my still life. But of course, you can use any other color as well. Like in landscapes, for example, I often use red as an imprimatura, or for portraits, I use green. So you are completely free, try whatever you feel might fit your motif. So what I do now is I just dilute my paint with turpentine oil and apply it all over the picture. And after that, I take this cotton cloth and wipe off the lighter objects and the light side of the jug again. You now can work out the darks as well, so that I have a good impression of my light and dark values. And if I want the lights and darks even more distinct, I can also take a soft brush now and make the imprimatura even more distinct. But this is not necessary. So now this has to dry for about 24 hours, and then we can do the first colored layer. My painting has had 24 hours to dry, and now I'm gonna do the second layer, which is the first colored layer. And this time I'm adding 2 more colors to my palette. That's burnt sienna and phthalo blue. And it would be good if you also did mixing exercises at home with these 2 colors in preparation. Because on the one hand, you will get to know the many colors, the many hues that you can achieve with them. And you can also try out what color effects you achieve when you mix the colors, or on the other hand, if you lay them on top of each other with a glaze. Here I have 3 examples where I mixed my starting colors with phthalo blue. And if I glaze the phthalo blue over the colors without mixing, I get this effect. And I can even change the color hue by just taking off some of the paint with turpentine. Okay, back to our painting. I will use a mixture of linseed oil and turpentine for this layer, approximately 1:1. And I will now first create the dark background for my painting. And for that, I simply mix different shades of brown from all of my basic colors, which I will of course use later in the motif, and the burnt sienna. And since the paint will now remain wet for at least a couple of hours, I will be able to match the color to the colors of my motifs later. And I first applied very roughly with a bristle brush and blend the colors into each other so that an even surface is created. But I still want different colors in the different places of the background. Like for example, on the left side where the light comes in, I add a little more red, and in the shadow, I add a little more blue. Since I want the apples to shine out of the picture, I try to work with colors that are as pure as possible, as I showed you in the first part of our course. And this time I'm using cadmium yellow and phthalo blue because the green you get from these 2 colors is much cooler and a lot more intensive than the green you get with the warm ultramarine blue. For the shadow color, I simply use more blue, and I also mix in a bit of my background color, because that way I get a harmonization between the objects of my still life and the background. In the jug, I use the same colors as in the background, but I also add a bit of white because the jug is sort of grayish brownish, and I also let the color of the apples reflect in the jug. And here too, I blend the first strong bristle brushes with my angled brush. And after I have finished that, I can adjust the background again. And again, I let the colors of my apples reflect onto the background. Okay, and next I simply mix a yellowish beige color from all my colors so that the color of the table looks very broken in contrast to the bright apples. And I also let the edges of my board disappear softly in the background. At this point, I find it very important to set up the picture and look at it from a certain distance, because only from a certain distance I can judge whether all the drawings are correct, whether the colors match each other, and as a whole, whether the painting is satisfying at this stage. And to do this, I put the picture on a field easel, which I also would like to introduce to you on this occasion. And this is something I recommend to all beginners, but also to professionals who may not have the space at home to keep a large workshop easel permanently. The field easel is relatively light, it's very easy to set up and put back together, and best of all, you can make it completely flat so that you can paint on it like you would on a table. And this may not be as important for oil painting, but anyone who wants to use them for watercolor painting will really appreciate it. And since I'm quite happy with my second layer of paint so far, I let the picture dry for another 2 or 3 days. So before we apply the second colored layer, there is something you should know about your oil paints. There are transparent and opaque pigments, which means some allow the light to penetrate the layer and go down to the painting surface, and others reflect the light on the colored layer. When I now paint my objects that are supposed to look illuminated with opaque pigments and in thicker layers of color, I increase the three-dimensional effect through the different refraction of light. You can also use this in alla prima painting, but it works best in layer painting. You can see which pigments are opaque or transparent in this little box on the tube. Depending on whether it is filled, half filled or empty, they are opaque or not. Now let me show you my painting again, how it looks when it's dried. It no longer has a greasy shine and the surface feels slightly rough. So my next layer should now adhere very well to this. By the way, this is what the surface of my little alla prima sketch looks like that I painted as a preparation for this course. And I think you can see the difference to our painting very clearly. So let's get started. I'm quite happy with the dark tones so far, and I will now cover all the areas that are illuminated with a lighter color. But I make sure that I don't use too much white yet, but rather always use the next lighter color first, which means if I want to lighten up this green apple, I try cadmium yellow first before I add white. And why do I do that? Because the gray trap, as we call it, is feared by beginners and professionals alike in oil painting. And it happens when you add white to the colors too early, you often end up with a gray that looks dull and cold and distorts the light-dark values. And to thin my paint, I only add linseed oil to my paints in this second layer. The painting process is basically self-explanatory now. I mix the same colors again as I did for the first layer and try different variations, of course. Because that's the really exciting thing about oil paints, that you can paint into the wet paint again and again, try out different hues and shades, make the color lighter or darker, whatever suits your own point of view. For experienced artists, this is an automatic process that happens like driving a car. So I can't really explain it. You have to try out yourselves. What is perhaps interesting to know is that on the apples, you can see a reflection of the table surface in the shadow. And this must be lighter, of course, but also cooler, so that it does not compete with the warmer lights on the light side. The work that I love most in the end is always the very dark and very light accents, because they always give the picture the final touch of depth. And at the very end, I make small drawings on the apples and correct the last little unevenness. So the picture now has to dry thoroughly again, and then you can compensate for the different shine, which I hope you can clearly see here, with a final coat of varnish. With these relatively thin layers here, I would risk it after 3 or 4 months. But if you paint in more layers, or you apply the paint in thicker layers, the drying process can take up to 1 year. So this brings us to the end of this second part, and you can probably imagine what your task is going to be. Create a chart with your basic colors and as many mixtures of 2 basic colors as possible, and then on them try out different glazes. And then of course it would make sense to paint several still lifes with different basic moods. So for example, one still life in blue and red and one in brown and green, anything you like. I'll say goodbye until next time, where in the last part of this course I will introduce you to another way of painting in layers, namely with a grisaille as an underpainting. Until then, have a good time. I'm looking forward to seeing you.